The light bar came on somewhere around mile marker 14, just past the grain elevator where the county road bent south toward the water tower. Dana Reyes saw it in her rearview and felt her stomach do the small, quiet thing it always did, not fear exactly, more like the body recognizing that the next few minutes would require attention. She signaled, pulled the accord onto the gravel shoulder, killed her speed, and put the car in park before the cruiser had fully stopped behind her. She sat with both hands at 10 and 2. Through the mirror she watched the officer run her plates. The light bar pulsed blue and white against the dark tree line. It was a Tuesday in late October, 9:15, and the temperature had dropped enough that the windows were starting to fog at the edges. She'd driven this stretch of Caldwell County Route 7 a dozen times in the past 4 months, but always in daylight, always heading the other way. She knew the road the way you know a back hallway, not by its features but by its rhythms. The cruiser door opened. She watched his approach in the mirror. He came up on her driver's side with the flashlight held at shoulder height, the beam sweeping the interior as he walked. She'd already rolled the window down. He was big, not the kind of big that comes from the gym, but the kind that comes from carrying weight in the same places for too many years. Wide through the chest and shoulders, thick at the jaw. His uniform was pressed, though. She noticed that. The creases sharp, the badge centered. He had the look of a man who still cared about how the uniform looked even if he'd stopped caring about some other things. License and registration. His voice was flat, not hostile yet, just flat. The voice of a man who'd said those 3 words so many times they'd stopped meaning anything to him. She reached into the cup holder for her license and handed it over, then opened the glove compartment for the registration. Slow movements, deliberate. She was wearing a gray flannel shirt, jeans, boots. Her hair was down, nothing about her announced what she was. You know why I stopped you? I was doing 58 in the 45. He looked at her license, looked at her, looked back at the license. His flashlight moved into the back seat, slowly taking inventory. There was a gym bag on the left, a jacket folded over it, and on the right side of the seat, a manila folder, closed, held shut with a rubber band. That your registration? She handed it through the window. He took it without looking at it, his eyes still on that folder. Atlanta address. Yes. Long way from Atlanta. She didn't answer that because it wasn't a question. He handed her registration back but kept the license. Sit tight, he walked back to the cruiser. Dana lowered her hands to her lap. She looked straight ahead through the windshield at the empty road. The headlights caught maybe 40 feet of it, the cracked center line, the kudzu creeping at the asphalt edge on the right, a possum frozen halfway across the lane. Then it moved, unhurried, and disappeared into the dark. She thought about the folder. It was her own fault, she knew that. She'd been at the county records annex that afternoon, a public building, a public errand, nothing that would have raised a flag by itself, and she'd stopped at her CI's place afterward, which she also knew she shouldn't have done, not a direct contact, not at his house. But Tommy Birch had been anxious in his last 3 text messages, and anxiety in a confidential informant is a thing you address before it becomes a problem. So she'd gone. She'd sat with him for 40 minutes in his kitchen while he told her about the conversation he'd overheard between Chief Kessler and the department's property manager. She'd taken notes, long ones, on paper because paper doesn't get subpoenaed the same way a phone does, and because there were things she didn't want moving across a network until she was ready to move them herself. The notes were in that folder. The folder was in the back seat. The officer had the kind of eyes that stop on things. She watched the cruiser in the mirror. The light bar kept pulsing. The radio inside was doing what police radios do, the low, automated voice of dispatch reading out unit numbers and 10 codes, the occasional broken-up response from somewhere across the county. She could hear fragments of it even from here. After 4 minutes, the officer came back. He handed her the license. Step out of the vehicle, please. She turned and looked at him just briefly. His face gave nothing away. Is there a problem? Step out, ma'am. She opened the door and got out. She was careful about it, no sudden movements, no reaching, nothing that could be misread. She stood on the gravel shoulder with her hands at her sides while he positioned himself between her and the car. What's in the back seat? Personal documents. Mind if I take a look? I do, actually. You're welcome to write me a speeding citation and I'll be on my way. His jaw shifted slightly. Something moved behind his eyes, not anger, not quite, but a recalibration. He was a man who was accustomed to compliance, and he recognized the absence of it with the precision of long practice. "Why don't you just open it up, make this simple? I'd rather you write the citation. Where are you coming from tonight?" "The county records building. That closed at 5. "I know, I had dinner afterward, I'm just passing through on my way back to the highway." "Dinner where? Does that matter?" He looked at her for a long moment. The flashlight was pointed at the ground between them, and in the backwash of light she could see his expression clearly. He didn't look angry. That was the thing about him that she was already noting and cataloging, the thing she would write down later with great precision. He didn't look angry. He looked patient. He looked like a man who had arrived at a decision and was simply waiting for the administrative steps to catch up with it. "I'm going to need you to come with me." "On what grounds?" "Suspicion of obstruction." He said it without hesitation. It came out practiced, which meant he'd used it this way before. She said, "I want to get my phone from the back seat." He put his hand on her arm before she'd even finished the sentence. She had started to turn toward the car and his hand came down on her left forearm, and then he moved a single efficient motion, the kind that people learn in academies and then refine over years of application, and her arm was behind her back, wrist forced up toward her shoulder blade, and the pain was immediate and sharp and specific. It shot from the joint outward in both directions. She went still. "Don't reach for anything," he said. His voice was calm. "That's my phone," she said. "I have a right to." "You have a right to remain silent." He already had the cuffs out. She listened to them click into place around her wrists. The gravel crunched under their feet. He walked her to the back of his cruiser and opened the rear door, and she got in without assistance because the alternative was to give him more to work with. He stood there for a moment looking at her through the open door. "You got somebody in Atlanta to call," he said. "Family, somebody who can come get your car." "I'm fine," she said. He closed the door. Sergeant Dale Pruett. She learned his name from the tag on his chest during booking, though she'd suspected who he was from the second block of the drive-in, when he keyed his radio and said, "Dispatch, this is Pruett, I'm 1015 coming in on a stop on County 7. And the dispatcher had said, "Copy that, Sergeant," in a way that suggested the sergeant didn't need to explain himself further. Dale Pruett had been with the Alderton Police Department for 17 years. She knew this because she'd been looking at his personnel file for 11 of the past 14 months. She knew that he'd been disciplined twice, once in 2014 for use of force exceeding department guidelines, and once in 2017 for an incident involving a traffic stop that resulted in a complaint that was, in the language of the Internal Affairs Summary, found to be unsubstantiated following a review of available evidence. She knew that he'd been promoted to sergeant in 2019, 6 months after the unsubstantiated complaint was filed, and 4 months after it was closed. She knew that he had a daughter who played travel soccer and an ex-wife in Macon, and a sister he called every Sunday morning. She knew that he was one of 3 officers in the department whom Chief Warren Kessler trusted absolutely, which meant, in the specific context of the federal investigation Dana had been running out of the Atlanta field office since January of last year, that Pruett was one of 3 officers who might have some knowledge of what Kessler had been doing with the money from Whitmore Construction. She hadn't put him at the center of it. She'd put him at the edge, which was where he probably lived, close enough to the arrangement to benefit from the protection it bought, far enough from the mechanics of it to maintain a certain useful deniability. She hadn't expected this. The booking room at Alderton PD was a rectangle about the size of a 2-car garage, lit by fluorescent panels that had yellowed unevenly. The smell was specific: industrial cleaner and old coffee, and the sour note that old buildings develop when their HVAC systems can't quite keep up. There was a desk sergeant named T. Birch, the name card faced outward, and when Pruett walked Dana through the door, cuffed, the young man at the desk looked up, and for just a fraction of a second something crossed his face that wasn't professional neutrality. It was recognition. Not of her specifically, of the situation, of what was about to happen. Tommy Birch was 28. He had red hair cut close to his head and a thin scar along his chin from a bicycle accident when he was 11, which she knew because they'd been meeting once a month for the better part of a year. He looked at her and he looked at Pruett and he opened his mouth and then he closed it and he reached for his intake form. Dana kept her face still. She looked at the middle distance and let Pruett walk her through the process. She answered the booking questions with her name, her Atlanta address, her date of birth. When they asked for her personal effects, she put her keys and her phone and her wallet on the counter. Pruett had taken the folder from her car as well, sealed in an evidence bag, and when it went onto the counter, she watched Tommy Birch's eyes track to it and then away. "Any medical conditions we should be aware of?" Tommy asked. His voice was completely steady. "I have a left shoulder that I'd like documented," she said. The arresting officer applied a restraint technique that may have caused soft tissue injury. I'd like that noted on intake. Pruett, standing to her left, made a small sound, not quite a laugh, not quite dismissal, somewhere between the two. Tommy wrote it down. She could see him writing it, the pen moving in small, careful strokes. They put her in a holding cell by herself. It was a room with a bench and a drain in the floor and a camera in the corner above the door. The camera had a fixed angle, it covered the door and about 2/3 of the bench. She sat in the uncovered third, not to hide herself, just because that was where the bench was least cold. Her shoulder ached in the deep specific way that soft tissue injury aches, not a sharp pain anymore, just an insistence, like something that has been moved out of its proper place and is waiting to be acknowledged. She sat with her hands between her knees and looked at the drain. 14 months, that was how long the case had been open. In that time she had filed 43 field reports, conducted 29 witness interviews, attended 11 coordination meetings at the Atlanta field office, and consumed more drive-through coffee than she would ever formally admit to. The case had a file number. It had a supervising agent, Marcus Webb, 15 years in the bureau, steady as a table. It had a prosecutor in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Atlanta who had looked at what they had in August and said, very carefully, "Another 3 months and I think we're there." 3 months, that had been 9 weeks ago. The case was about money at its core. Federal corruption cases usually are. Warren Kessler had been chief of the Alderton Police Department for 11 years. Before that, he'd been a deputy chief under a man named Holloway who retired clean and moved to coastal South Carolina, and Kessler had taken the job the way you take a hand-me-down suit, grateful for the fit, already planning the alterations. He was 61 now, a wide-shouldered man who wore his reading glasses on a cord around his neck and coached his grandson's little league team on Saturday mornings. Dana had watched him coach from a parking lot once, sitting in her car with a coffee going cold in the cup holder. He was patient with the kids. He moved along the first baseline clapping his hands, saying good eye, and the boys responded to him with the kind of relaxed trust that children show to adults who don't perform their authority. He had been taking money from Whitmore Construction since 2018. The arrangement wasn't complicated. Kessler steered city contract decisions through his contacts on the Public Works Committee. Whitmore won bids they shouldn't have won, and a portion of the overbilling cycled back through a property management company in Savannah that Kessler's brother-in-law technically owned, but had never in 4 years of operation visited in person. The amounts weren't enormous by federal corruption standards. In total, across 6 contracts, approximately $340,000. But attached to the money was something worse, something that had turned this from a routine RICO referral into the kind of case that kept Marcus Webb at his desk past midnight. In 2019, a man named Marcus Teal had been shot and killed during a foot pursuit by an Alderton officer named Raymond Cates. The official account filed by Cates, reviewed by Kessler, approved by the city attorney, said that Teal had turned with a weapon during the pursuit and Cates had fired in self-defense. The weapon, a .38 revolver, had been logged into property, held for 60 days, and destroyed per departmental protocol. What the official account did not mention, what Tommy Birch had told Dana in his kitchen over a pot of bad coffee 8 months ago, was that he had been in the property room in March of 2020 doing a routine inventory and he'd found a yellow evidence sticker on a shelf where a .22 caliber handgun should have been. Not the .38, a different gun entirely. He'd checked the log. The .22 was listed as being held in connection with an unrelated drug case from 2018, a case that had been closed, the evidence scheduled for destruction. It hadn't been destroyed. And the log had been amended by hand in blue ink in a handwriting Tommy had learned to identify by that point. The Chiefs. She hadn't known what it meant yet when Tommy first told her that. She needed 4 more months and a forensic document examiner and a source inside the county medical examiner's office to start to understand. But what the evidence was beginning to suggest, carefully, circumstantially, not yet beyond reasonable doubt but gathering toward it, was that Marcus Teal had been shot with the .22, and the .38 had been placed at the scene afterward. Marcus Teal had been 23 years old. He'd had a pending possession charge and a GED and a girlfriend named Cheryl who had filed a complaint with the state police 18 months after his death, and been told, after a 3-week review, that the department's investigation had been thorough and the evidence supported the officer's account. The girlfriend had a 7-year-old named Devonte who had Marcus Teal's eyes. Dana had met the girlfriend just once at a coffee shop in Augusta. She'd told her only that the investigation was ongoing. She hadn't told her what they had. She didn't do that anymore. She'd made that mistake on her second case out of Quantico, given a family more hope than the evidence could support, and watched the hope do damage when the case stalled. She'd stopped carrying families' expectations. It was one of the accommodations she'd made to this work, and she didn't feel good about it, and she'd stopped expecting to. She was thinking about all of this not linearly, just the way it surfaces when you're sitting in a room with nothing else to occupy you. When the door to the holding area opened and she heard Pruett's voice and another voice, younger and more careful, and then the door to her cell opened. Pruett was in the doorway. Tommy Birch was 2 steps behind him in the hallway, not looking at her. "There a problem?" Pruett said. She looked at him. "No. You keep asking Birch about your phone." "I asked him once if I could make a call. That's a right I have." "You'll get your call." He stood there a moment longer. He was studying her in a way that wasn't entirely comfortable, a close, assessing look that reminded her of the way you study something when you're not sure whether it's what you think it is. "What were you doing in Caldwell County?" "I already told you." "Tell me again." "I was at the county records building this afternoon on a personal matter. I had dinner. I was on my way back to the highway when you stopped me." "Whose house did you go to?" She kept her face neutral. "I don't know what you mean." "You went to dinner alone?" "Yes." He nodded slowly. "Okay," he said, and then, "That folder. Those are personal documents." "You said that." "Because it's the correct answer." He looked at the floor for a moment. When he looked up again, something in his expression had shifted. The assessment had resolved into something more settled. She didn't know yet what he'd settled on, but she could tell he had. "We're going to need to go through that folder. You're going to need a warrant." "Suspicion of obstruction." "Obstruction of what, specifically?" She said it calmly. "What crime are those documents alleged to be connected to? Because that's what your warrant affidavit is going to need to articulate, and you and I both know what happens when it can't." The silence stretched for about 4 seconds. "Get you your call," he said finally, and pulled the door closed. She called Marcus Webb at 10:47. She got 2 rings and then his voice fully awake. He was one of those people who slept light and came online fast like a generator with a short delay. She gave him the summary in 2 minutes. Stop on County 7, restraint, cuffed, obstruction charge, folder in evidence. She kept her voice level and quiet and specific. There was a pause on his end, not a long one. "Your cover is intact." "I think so." "He doesn't know, but he was asking about the folder and he was asking if I'd gone to anybody's house." Another pause. "Tommy." "He's fine. He handled intake and he was good." "Okay." She heard him shifting, the sound of a lamp clicking on. "Sit tight, I'm going to call Hendricks." Hendricks was the U.S. attorney. Dana said. "Marcus." "Yeah." "My shoulder." He twisted my arm. "I told booking I wanted it documented." A longer pause. "How bad?" "I don't know yet. It's holding." "All right, don't touch it, don't adjust it. When you're out, we go straight to a medical facility for documentation." "I know." "I know you know. I'm saying it anyway. You okay?" She thought about the question. The fluorescent light above the pay phone made a faint electrical hiss. "I'm fine," she said. "Tell Hendricks I want to stay clean on the timeline. I don't want anything from tonight accelerating the case before we're ready." "One thing at a time," Webb said. "Let me get you out first." He was there by 1 in the morning with a field supervisor named Carla Donahue, who Dana had worked with twice and respected mainly because Donahue never wasted anyone's time with performance. They came in with credentials and a phone call from the U.S. Attorney's Office and the Alderton PD's watch commander, a Lieutenant Gaines, 6 months from retirement, who clearly had not been briefed on any of this and who looked at what was happening in his booking room with the expression of a man watching a pipe burst in slow motion. Pruett had gone off shift at 11. He wasn't there when they processed Dana out. The folder came back to her in its evidence bag, seal unbroken. Donahue drove. Webb sat in the back with Dana and they rode in silence for about 4 miles before he said, "Tell me the whole thing, start from when the lights came on." She told him. She was precise about the sequence: the initial stop, his attention to the folder, the request to exit the vehicle, the refusal of consent to search, the restraint. She described the force used with the same detachment she would have used to describe the weather. Her left arm was in her lap and she was moving the fingers occasionally, not out of pain management, just to check the signal. "He know who you are?" Webb asked. "He didn't when he stopped me. I don't know what he knows now." His interest in the folder, he was fishing or he had something specific? "Fishing, I think. He stopped me for a real violation. I was doing 58. If he'd had specific intelligence, he would have handled it differently." Webb was quiet for a moment. This could be coincidence. "Yes." "Pruett stops cars on County 7, it's his sector." "Yes." "And you happen to be on County 7 coming from Tommy's house." She didn't say anything. "Dana." "I know," she said, "I know." The emergency clinic was in a strip mall in the next county. A doctor who looked young enough to still be apologetic about it examined her shoulder and sent her for an X-ray and came back to tell her there was no fracture but that there was significant soft tissue strain and possibly a partial tear in the superior labrum, which would require an MRI to confirm. He gave her a soft brace and a prescription for anti-inflammatories, and she put the brace on in the parking lot while Webb stood by the car and made calls. The night had gone cold and clear. Stars visible. She could smell wood smoke from somewhere and the faint chemical sweetness of a fast food place a block over. She stood on the asphalt in her gray flannel shirt with her arm in the brace, and felt, not for the first time in this work, but always with a particular quality, the specific weight of having been in the wrong place with the wrong person, and the completely ordinary way that wrong can find you when you're carrying 14 months of careful work. She wasn't angry, she'd have to think about why later. 3 days after the arrest, Dale Pruett filed a counter-complaint with the Alderton PD Internal Affairs Office, alleging that the woman he had stopped on County 7 had been uncooperative, verbally abusive, and in the language of his written statement, appeared intoxicated and exhibited erratic behavior consistent with possible impairment. He also alleged that she had reached into the vehicle in a way that caused him to believe she was reaching for a weapon, necessitating the restraint technique employed. Dana read the complaint at her desk in Atlanta. She read it twice. The second time she was looking not for what was in it but for what it suggested about his state of mind, and what she found was not entirely what she expected. The complaint was careful. It was specific about sequence and legalistic about justification. It read like something that had been reviewed by someone before submission. She forwarded it to Marcus Webb with a single line: "He talked to somebody." Webb replied 20 minutes later, "Yes." What happened between the night of the stop and the filing of that complaint was something they only fully understood later, but they were able to reconstruct it reasonably well from the recordings Tommy Birch's device captured from the vent above Warren Kessler's office. The device was a commercial audio recorder modified by the field office's tech team, about the size of a thumb drive, attached to the inside of the vent housing with epoxy putty, activated remotely via a signal that Tommy could trigger from his phone. The warrant for it had taken 6 weeks to obtain, and had been reviewed by 3 separate federal judges before being approved, which was the kind of bureaucratic friction that investigators found infuriating in the moment, and indispensable in the courtroom. The recording from the day after the stop was 43 minutes long. Kessler's voice was clear. He sat close to the vent, apparently a habit. Pruett's was slightly more distant, positioned across the desk. A third voice appeared briefly at the beginning. It sounded like Lieutenant Gaines, who said almost nothing and left after about 4 minutes. What remained was a conversation between 2 men who had known each other for over a decade and who communicated in the shorthand of long mutual understanding. Kessler didn't ask, "Did you hurt her?" He asked, "How bad is the complaint going to be?" Pruett said he didn't know yet. She'd asked for documentation at intake. Kessler said, "Who took intake?" Pruett said, "Birch." There was a pause that lasted almost 8 seconds on the recording. Then Kessler said okay in a tone that meant something other than agreement. Then write it up, your version, get it in before she does anything. She's FBI Warren. I know what she is. She's going to file something. I know, get it in first. The arm thing was a pause. You had cause to believe she was going for the vehicle. She was reaching for her phone. You had cause to believe she was reaching for a weapon, that's the language. A long silence, then Pruett said, what do you think she was doing up here? Kessler's voice came back quieter, I don't know, but I'd like to. That was the sentence. That was the sentence that Dana and Webb played back 4 times in the conference room and that the prosecutor, a careful man named Aldridge, underlined in his yellow legal pad, I don't know. But I'd like to, because it suggested awareness of the investigation without confirming knowledge of its specific content, and what it told them was that Kessler understood the general shape of his exposure even if he didn't yet know its precise dimensions. It also told them they needed to move faster than they'd planned. The MRI confirmed the partial labral tear 3 weeks after the stop. The orthopedic surgeon at Emory was a brisk woman who used the phrase non-trivial twice and recommended surgical repair with a recovery time of 3 to 4 months. Dana scheduled the surgery for January, which was 6 weeks away, and drove back to the office in the soft brace with a referral slip on her passenger seat and the low-grade ache that had become, in 3 weeks, something close to normal. She was sitting in the parking structure at the federal building when her phone rang. Webb. Pruett's got a lawyer, he said. I heard. Not a local, a firm out of Atlanta. She thought about that, Kessler's funding it. Through 2 removes looks like Aldridge is working on it. A pause, Dana. Yeah. They subpoenaed your personnel file this morning, his lawyer filed. She was quiet. It's a fishing trip, Webb said. Standard response. They want to find anything that makes the stop look like it was something you provoked. Prior use of force, complaints, performance issues. There aren't any. I know, but they want the discovery process to take time. She understood. The complaint she'd filed against Pruett for civil rights violation, false arrest, excessive force, was a separate track from the underlying corruption investigation, but it had opened a door and Pruett's attorney was trying to use it to blow a draft through the whole house. It was competent lawyering. It was also a signal that someone in Kessler's orbit understood the stakes clearly enough to start building a defense before charges had even been filed. How long do we have? She asked. Aldridge says 6 weeks, maybe 8 if we need the forensic accountant's second pass on the Whitmore financials. What does he need from me? Tommy. She sat back in her seat. Outside the parking structure, she could hear the city traffic, a distant horn, the white noise of downtown Atlanta on a gray Thursday afternoon. He's not ready. He's going to have to be. He's been feeding us information for 14 months. If we put him in front of Aldridge now, he's done in Alderton. His family's there, his. I know that. Mother, his brother, he's got a hole. Dana, I know, but if we don't move, Kessler starts moving first and we lose the window on the Teal evidence. Aldridge says the forensic chain on the ballistics has a 90-day shelf life before the defense can start challenging custody. We're at 78. She closed her eyes. Behind them she saw Tommy Birch's face across his kitchen table, the coffee cup cradled in both hands, telling her about the yellow evidence sticker on an empty shelf. The way he'd looked, not heroic, not defiant, just tired and a little frightened and determined in the way that ordinary people are sometimes determined, which is quietly and without ceremony and at significant personal cost. Set up the meeting, she said, I'll talk to him first. She drove up to Caldwell County on a Sunday. Not to Tommy's house, they'd agreed to a location in a town 40 miles east, a diner near a truck stop on Route 23 that neither of them had reason to frequent. She got there early and sat in a booth by the window and ordered coffee and watched the parking lot. He came in at noon on time, wearing a Braves cap and a jacket that was a size too large. He looked thin. He sat down across from her and took the cap off and held it in his hands on the table. You look better, he said. I'm okay, she touched the brace through her sleeve. It heals. He looked at the table. His coffee came and he wrapped both hands around it and she waited, because she had learned that Tommy Birch needed space before he could say what he needed to say. He knows, Tommy said. Kessler, he doesn't know it's me, but he knows somebody's in the building. What did he do? Changed the Wi-Fi password, had the IT guy sweep the office for devices. He paused, didn't find yours. It's not wireless. I know, I'm just saying he's scared and scared is. He looked up. Scared is worse than comfortable, right? When he was comfortable I could predict him. Yes, she said, that's right. They were quiet for a moment. A truck out in the lot fired up its engine with a sound like a big animal waking. We need you to come to Atlanta, Dana said. Sit with the prosecutor. He looked out the window for a long moment, formal. On the record, not testimony yet, a proffer session. You walk them through what you've seen, what you've given us, establish the foundation. And then it's over, my being there. Yes. The word landed between them. He picked up his coffee and took a long drink and set it back down. He was quiet for about 30 seconds and she let him have them. My mom's in the same county, he said. She's been there 30 years. I know. She's not going to understand. No. People up there, they're going to think. Tommy, she waited until he looked at her. You know what the alternative is. He did know. That was the thing about Tommy Birch. He'd known from the day he walked into a coffee shop in Augusta and sat across from a woman he'd never met and said, I think something's wrong and I don't know what to do about it. He'd known then and he knew now. There was no version of this where he came out clean. He'd made a choice when he picked up his phone and the consequences of the choice were what they were, and the only question that remained was whether the thing it produced was worth what it cost. Okay, he said. She nodded. She didn't say anything else because there was nothing useful to say. The proffer session was a Thursday in December, in a conference room at the federal building in Atlanta that smelled like printer toner and the lunch someone had eaten at the table an hour before. Tommy sat at one end with his attorney, a patient woman named Solis who'd been appointed through the Federal Witness Assistance Program. Aldridge sat at the other end with his second chair. Dana was in the room as a witness, not a participant. She sat against the wall with a legal pad and a pen she didn't use. Tommy talked for 4 hours. He was methodical, he didn't dramatize. He spoke in the flat, careful way of someone who has rehearsed what he's going to say so many times that the rehearsal has worn away anything that wasn't necessary. He talked about the evidence sticker. He talked about the log amendments. He talked about a conversation he'd overheard in November of the previous year between Kessler and a man he later identified from a photograph as Greg Whitmore, owner of Whitmore Construction, in which Whitmore had referenced the arrangement. And Kessler had said, let's not do this on the phone, and Whitmore had said, I'm not on the phone, I'm in your office. He talked about a filing cabinet in the property room that had a lock that wasn't on the original building plans and that Tommy had, on one occasion, seen Kessler open with a key he kept on his personal ring. Aldridge didn't react to any of it. He wrote. He asked clarifying questions in a voice that conveyed no judgment, no excitement, nothing that might contaminate the cleanness of the record. His second chair did the same. At one point, Tommy paused and looked at the table and said, there's one more thing. He said it the way people say it when they've been deciding whether to say it for a long time. About the night of the stop, when Pruett brought her in. The room was quiet. I was on the desk, I'm the one who processed the credentials. He looked up at Aldridge. I knew who she was, I'd known for a long time, but Pruett, when he came back out after he found out she was FBI, he said something to Gaines. Lieutenant Gaines, he said. He stopped. He appeared to be choosing his words. He said, did you know we had a Fed running around up here? And Gaines said, I don't want to know anything about anything. And Pruett said, I need to call Warren. He stopped. That's what he said, Tommy said, word for word, because I was right there and I made myself remember it. He looked at Dana briefly. I knew she was going to need it. The room was very quiet. Dana kept her face neutral and looked at her legal pad. Later, in the hallway, while Tommy's attorney was in the restroom and Aldridge had gone to make a call, Webb stood next to Dana at the window that looked out over Peachtree Street and they watched the traffic for a moment. That's enough, Webb said. He meant the case. He meant Aldridge would say yes. Yes, Dana said. How long for the warrant package? 3 weeks if we push. He nodded. Below them, a light rail train moved through the intersection, silent from this height, just a long silver shape in the afternoon light. How's the shoulder? Surgery's the 4th. You'll be in a sling for the arraignment. She hadn't thought about that, she thought about it now. It'll be fine. The indictment was handed down on a Tuesday in January, 41 days after Tommy Birch's proffer session. 14 counts: federal bribery, conspiracy to commit bribery, obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, civil rights violations under color of law in connection with the death of Marcus Teal, and wire fraud related to the Whitmore construction contracts. The last count was added by Aldridge at the last moment. A single email found in Whitmore's business account in which he had sent routing information for a transfer to the property management company in Savannah, and Kessler had replied with a single word: confirmed. 14 counts. Aldridge had presented the case to the grand jury over 3 days, and they had taken 4 hours to return. Dale Pruett was not among the indicted. He'd been offered a plea agreement 6 weeks prior through his attorney by Webb's team. 1 count: civil rights violation under color of law relating to the unlawful arrest and use of force on October 14. Federal minimum security 18 months. In exchange, full cooperation with the case against Kessler. Testimony at trial if needed. A signed statement that he'd been directed by Kessler to file the countercomplaint and to falsify the language about the weapon. He'd taken the deal on a Monday morning in a room with his lawyer and his daughter, who was 17 and who sat in the corner during the meeting with her hands folded in her lap and didn't say a word. Dana wasn't present for the deal. She heard about the daughter from Webb, who'd been in the room. "How'd he seem?" she'd asked. Webb had been quiet for a moment. "Tired," he said, like he'd been tired for a long time and was just now letting himself show it. She thought about that for days afterward, in the way she thought about things she didn't fully understand yet. The interrogation that mattered most, the one she would have carried differently if she'd known than what she knew later, wasn't the one with Pruett. It was the one with Kessler in February after his arrest, in a room at the federal building that was spare in the way federal rooms are spare. Table, chairs, a clock on the wall, a camera in the corner with a red light that meant it was running. He came in a suit, no tie. His attorney was a partner from a firm in Buckhead who'd flown in that morning and who sat beside him with the composed stillness of expensive legal counsel. Kessler himself looked, and Dana spent time thinking about how to describe this in her notes in the conversations she had with Webb afterward, not what she'd expected. She'd expected either the bluster or the flatness, the man performing composure or the man who'd genuinely gone remote. Instead, he looked present. Alert in the way of someone who understands the exact shape of the situation and has stopped trying to see around it. He looked at her when she came in. She sat down across from him and put a notepad on the table. Webb was beside her. The attorney made the initial statement his client was cooperating with the attendance requirement but reserved all rights, etc. Standard. Webb opened. He did the formalities, the advisements, the introductions for the record. He was good at this, Webb, at the patience of it. He moved through the early questions about Kessler's tenure, his administrative responsibilities, the oversight of the property room, as if they were filling out a form together and there was no particular urgency to any of it. Kessler answered everything, short sentences, accurate as far as Dana could tell against 14 months of material in her head. He didn't evade on the small things, which meant he was conserving the evasions. About 40 minutes in, Webb said, "Chief Kessler, I want to ask you about a filing cabinet in the property room of the Alderton PD. A cabinet with a non-standard lock serial number." He checked his notes, though she knew he had the number memorized, H17-4492. "Are you familiar with that cabinet?" A pause. Kessler's eyes moved to his attorney, who gave a small nod. "I don't believe I'm familiar with a specific cabinet by that description," Kessler said. Webb nodded as if this were a perfectly reasonable answer and wrote something down. "And your personal key ring, the one you typically carry on your person during work hours, could you describe for me what keys are on it?" The attorney said, "I'm going to advise my client too." "That's fine," Webb said pleasantly. Kessler was looking at the table. His hand, Dana noticed and would note in her report because these things mattered, his left hand was resting on the table and his index finger was pressing lightly against the surface. Not a gesture of agitation. The opposite, the deliberate stillness of a man suppressing agitation. She said nothing. Webb moved to the Whitmore contracts. He laid the timeline out across the next 15 minutes with the patience of a man laying tile, flat, even one piece at a time. contract bids, award dates, payment transfers, the property management company in Savannah. He named figures without inflection. He quoted the email with the single word confirmed and let the quotation sit there in the room without comment. Kessler's attorney leaned over and they had a brief exchange too quiet for the mic. Then Kessler said, for the first time, on advice of counsel, I'm going to decline to answer further questions at this time. Webb said, of course. He closed his notepad. He gathered his materials with the deliberate, unhurried precision of someone who is not worried about time. He stood up and Dana stood up with him and Kessler watched them from across the table. At the door, Kessler said, Agent Reyes. She turned. He looked at her, whatever he'd intended to say, and she thought about this for weeks afterward, the incomplete thing, the sentence he chose not to finish, he didn't say it. He looked at her arm instead, at the sling, then he looked at the table. She left. The arraignment was on a Thursday in March. She drove down from Atlanta in the morning and parked in the federal courthouse garage and sat in the car for a few minutes before going in. Her arm was out of the full sling by then, 3 weeks post-surgery, cleared for light activity, but she was wearing the partial brace under her jacket and could feel the pull of the repaired tissue when she moved her arm too far in any direction. The courtroom was federal, which meant it was large and oak-paneled and had the specific acoustic quality of rooms designed to emphasize the weight of what happens in them. She sat in the gallery with Webb and Donahue and a junior agent named Price who'd been on the case for the last 4 months. Aldridge was at the prosecution table in a dark suit and his habitual expression of contained focus. Kessler came in from the right with his attorneys. He looked smaller in this room than he'd looked in his office, which was not a physical assessment, he was the same size. It was something about the space, or what the space represented, or the specific way that a man who has held authority for a long time looks when the authority is being formally removed. The clerk read the charges, 14 of them. Each one landed in the room with a flat, procedural finality. Kessler stood with his hands at his sides and said not guilty in a voice that was entirely composed, and that told her nothing. Pruett wasn't there. His plea had been processed separately in a different room in November, and he was serving his time in a federal facility in Alabama. His daughter had apparently maintained contact. Dana didn't know this for cert. She knew it the way you know things in this work, through the gaps, through inference, through the specific quality of silence that surrounds facts nobody has a professional reason to state. Tommy Birch's role had become a matter of public record in December, when the defense attorneys obtained limited discovery on the investigation. He'd been placed on administrative leave by the Alderton PD pending an internal review, which was still ongoing as of arraignment day. He'd moved out of his house and was staying, as far as Dana knew, with his brother in a town 2 counties over. She thought about him during the reading of the charges. She thought about his kitchen, which smelled like dish soap and the kind of coffee you buy at a gas station, and his hands wrapped around the mug, and the way he'd looked at her when she'd asked him, back in October of last year, the very first time they met, "Why are you coming to us? Why not the state police?" And he'd said, in that quiet, thinking out loud voice he had, "I guess because it's bigger than the state police." She'd looked at him across the table and thought, yes. She didn't stay for the whole proceeding. Not guilty pleas, a trial date set for October, a bail hearing scheduled for the following week. Standard sequence. She'd seen it before. She'd be back for the trial. In the lobby, she stopped at a water fountain and took a drink and straightened up and stood for a moment. The marble floor of a federal courthouse, even in a mid-sized city, has a particular smell, stone, and humidity, and the old accumulated weight of everything that has moved through it. She'd always noticed it. Outside it was overcast. The sky had the flat, white quality of a southern spring trying to happen, warm enough, just cloudy enough that the light didn't declare itself. She stood on the courthouse steps for a moment before walking to the parking structure. A group of pigeons were working the bottom step, moving with the self-possessed urgency of birds who don't know they're in the background of anything. She walked past them, they didn't move. In the car, she sat for a moment with the engine off. Her arm ached the way it would ache for months, not sharply, just persistently, the surgical site reminding her that repaired things carry the memory of the damage. She would have full range of motion eventually. That was what the surgeon had said, full range of motion, no long-term limitation. It had sounded like a promise, And she'd received it the way she received most promises in this work, which was with appreciation for the intention and appropriate suspension of certainty. She started the car. She thought about Marcus Teal. She thought about his 7-year-old, who was 8 now, who would be told something by his mother at some point in some age-appropriate way that still wouldn't come close to explaining what had happened. She thought about the way justice moved, not the way it looked from the outside, clean and declarative and final, but the way it felt from the inside. Slow, expensive, partial, arrived at sideways, heavy in a way that left no room for anything celebratory. She pulled out of the space and drove toward the garage exit. The attendant waved her through without looking up. The city opened in front of her, traffic, signals, the geometry of a Thursday morning in mid-March, ordinary and indifferent and fully intact. She merged left and headed north toward the highway, and the courthouse shrank in the mirror until it didn't. And